And those coaches are going to lose retention quickly.
Knowing something and being able to teach it back to that person are two totally separate things.
I don't think we're in that game anymore. You've gone from being in shape yourself to how in shape your business is. I think that if you don't do that, you can be the best kept secret in the industry, which is such a shame if you're a high quality coach.
The reason most of us got into the fitness industry was because we actually enjoyed being around people, and then we somehow idolize this idea of escaping from every other person.
You can't be on the fence. You can't be 5, or you can't be 3 out of 5. You can't be 5 out of 10. You have to be slightly good or slightly shit.
And that's what I try and do now more than anything is just be critical of those I like and try and be accepting of those I dislike.
So Jack, I said before we click record that I haven't done in a very, very long time the question of who are you? Introduce yourself. We normally go straight into it, but I've seen behind the scenes in the elevation group that we have with Dean Hammond and Supercharge, the value you can give coaches. And like me, you're one of the newer guys in the space, helping coaches get better results and find their love for training again. So for people who don't know who you are, tell us a little about who Jack is.
Yeah, no worries. Also, firstly, let me just say thank you for having me. Like you said, when you're an up-and-coming coach, you don't often get as many platforms to kind of speak your values and stuff. So I do appreciate you having me on. So I've been a coach now for about 8 years. I started at M10 about 5 years ago. Beforehand, I was dotting between private facilities and commercial facilities. But for anyone that is or has been in this space for a little bit longer, you know, M10 is fairly reputable for our standards and our results. And, you know, stepping into M10 5 years ago really accelerated and excelled my growth as a coach, I would say. You know, just being surrounded by like-minded coaches or with the same values and being very client-centered, I saw a lot of growth and development over those 5 years. And probably about 2 years ago, maybe 1.5 years ago, I became head of education at M10 and kind of fronted the education providing that we do for other coaches around the UK. And now basically, aside from some online coaching, that's what I do. That's my main role, to educate coaches around the world to essentially be better at their job.
Yeah, I've always admired the business Mark's built, and I've been lucky enough to speak to Mark on this platform, and he's definitely one of the good guys in the industry where he's, despite, and everyone gets burnt by people in this space, but he gives his coach a platform. He seems to keep a good relationship with people, and I've seen people, you know, when I was at UP that came from M10, and he always had that quality and that leg up coming in and fitted into the UP mold really, really well when they moved to London. So like for a coach who's maybe newer to this, with the online boom, people tend to go straight from a Virgin Active, a Pure Gym onto online, or even straight into online now. When we started, it was more you were, the aim was to go to an Ultimate Performance, to go to an M10. What do you feel were like the biggest lessons doing that coaches miss out on now?
I think it's I think a lot of it is that there is an expectation that we see this all the time with coaches that we educate. When they're in a commercial facility, they think that the type of client that walks through the door in M10 is a different breed. So they're just thinking, oh, well, I don't get very good clients, so that's the reason I can't get results. Stepping into M10 is exactly the same. Like the caliber of client that walks through the door was relatively the same. You've got to remember, like, Gen Pop clients didn't know who M10 were. Like, the reputation was in the fitness industry, not in the Gen Pop space. Yes. So we were getting that like level of result with normal people with the exact same problems that every other coach would face. And I think that was a really like glass shattering moment, because aside from, you know, the environment being so cultivated around education and growth, was you realized that the thing that was stopping you getting results was just your own development. That's it. Like, not the client, not really anything else. It's just you being better at your job.
Yeah, I would second that. And I tell you what, there's one thing that I can heartily say is a huge positive to places like Ultimate Performance. Actually, there's two things. I think the first thing is just opening my eyes to what the people in the space. Like, I wouldn't have known who Brian Walsh was, or a Kelly Starrett, or an RTS, or a Michael Goulden, or a Kassem, or a Jordan Shallow, had I not gone through that process and like experienced those coaches. But to follow on from your point, the one I think is really, really important is that UP taught me a standard. So like, we are not, I don't want to say we're naturally lazy as coaches, but like when you're a new coach, you have no idea what works, what's the standard, what's the level of professionalism, because we often come in as kids, right? We see some people come in as being accountants and understand this pressure, but most don't. So for me, things like before and after photos being lined up properly, that's attention to detail with results that, you know, when you see a movie where the frame rate's slightly off and you can't put a finger why it looks slightly strange, that's the thing like before and after photos, or what a PT session should be like, and the quality and the intensity and the care and attention. That is something I don't think that a lot of coaches learn now, that we see really small mistakes, or just that professionalism element that comes from being around, as you said, lawyers, accountants, investment bankers, and working with like someone like Mark, and in my case, people like Nick and Eddie Baruta and great coaches like that, that kind of go, well, you need to live up to that. You need to be someone that's worth investing big amounts of money in. Would you agree with that with the people that came into M10?
Yeah, definitely. Your respect for that person increased massively. Because I think a lot of the time, like, especially when we're younger, you know, we're a little bit more egotistical and we're relatively self-centered. I agree. Like, especially when you're younger. So you're relatively entitled when you go into that coaching relationship that, you know, if the client's not giving you everything, then it's the client's fault. And the danger we're seeing now, especially with, you know, some of the coaches learning from certain other coaches, is that's being kind of reinforced as an ideology rather than looking inwards and going, okay, as the coach, what am I doing wrong? What can I do better for that client? It's almost now that things are being twisted in a way that, well, the client's the one with the problem, and the client's not giving enough, and it's the client's fault. And I think really when you enter those spaces like we did, those more developed gym floors, it is really about, you know, looking inwards first and going, have I genuinely done everything I can for this client before I blame them for anything? You know, from an adherence standpoint, have I just given them the wrong plan? You know?
Yes, I agree with that. And I think there's a balancing act here as well. I think, like, I burnt myself out really quickly by always taking things so insular. So it was always my fault why a client didn't get a result. And I think that can be just as damaging as passing off as it's just a client. The client doesn't want it enough. So I think there is an element of like, we can't force a client to want something they don't want. It's so hard. Like, I'm in this position now in my 30s where, like, the idea maybe I should hire someone like you, because I know this is exactly what you do for a living. So maybe this is a sales consultation. But in my 30s, the desire to be dick skin lean anymore isn't there. Being married and being essentially an office worker, and I know when you don't have that why, how difficult it can be. So at the same time, we've got to understand that, like, it's down to, like, I always say this, if it's a Harry Potter story, your clients are Harry. They're the hero of this. You are Dumbledore. But on the flip side of this, I don't think coaches are very good at setting expectations. I don't think coaches ask enough to find out what the goals are. I don't think we create urgency. So I think within every coach's roster, there is a pool of clients that, if they had a bit of direction, could be great, but the coach hasn't given them that direction. Is there, like, when it comes to like urgency and like setting, like, do you feel like that's the case? Do you feel like most coaches aren't skilled in that, like, getting a destination for people?
Yeah, and I've definitely been there. I would say that's also a massive thing that changed when I started at M10, that there was actually a structure to the onboarding process. And when the client walked through the door, you had many points of contact, and it was a vital component that you laid down the expectations for the client and explained what was going to happen, what those first few sessions were going to look like, that you needed a lot of data collection and all these things. And I was speaking to a coach about it the other day, actually, and I think the reason a lot of coaches struggle with that is because now sales is such a massive, I guess, stopping point for a lot of coaches, and a struggling point is, once they've made a successful sale, they're like, right, I need to rush into these sessions and deliver, because that's what the client expects, rather than okay, I've signed them up. Now I need to onboard them smoothly and layer all that professionalism in and layer those boundaries and expectations and stuff. And I can see both sides of it. I was the previous coach. I rushed into things because I thought if I didn't, the client would leave and they would, buyer's remorse. They would see that they've invested in their own coach because I was relatively insecure and inexperienced. But yeah, stepping into M10, I learned that, setting those boundaries, setting those expectations from the start and really road mapping for the client was probably one of the most important aspects of the coaching relationship.
I absolutely agree with that. Do you think there's ever a time to fire a client?
It's hard to say fire a client because that sounds so permanent. I've definitely had it in the past where I've really struggled to nudge them forward, and I've had those conversations as to maybe from a timing perspective, maybe it's not the right time. There's evidently a mental block. I've had conversations with clients where I've been like, look, genuinely, I think you need a different layer of support that's not a physical trainer. I think you need some form of therapist or etc. But that doesn't mean that you can't come back when you're ready. And I think that's the difference, right? Like, it's not like you're saying, tell you what, just leave it, fitness isn't for you. Like, there's never going to be a conversation like that. But there have been moments in time where it's been like, look, timing wise, it's probably not right, but I know it will be later. So when this has changed, come back to me and we'll get that result.
Yeah, I'm like yourself in the sense of I hate that terminology, and I while I agree, and I just want to caveat this because I know what you're meaning by this, that there is a time and a place. Okay, maybe I'm not the right amount of support. You from a humble place going, look, I think you could get more help from seeing this therapist, and I don't want to waste your time and money if this is the thing that's going to drive the needle forward. But I also feel coaches sometimes, they want someone to take away the responsibility from them. So they'll hire an external therapist, they'll hire a nutrition person, they'll hire someone to write the training programs for them so they can just be the social media guy really quickly. And I think, I know from knowing you and the integrity you have as a coach, that conversation of the therapist coming in was after you tried tons and tons and tons of options.
Yeah,
and the reason I have a hard time with people firing clients, I think it's the nuclear war of approaches. It's the absolute last resort. And I think for me to fire, quote unquote, a client, they need to do something super unprofessional. They need to insult or offend someone in the business. They need to generally be affecting how the operations run for other people. Because I think there's two things that happens when you decide to get rid of a client because they're not adherent. One, you're essentially saying, my goals for you are more important than your goals for yourself. And you're assuming that the before and after is the only value that I can receive from coming to train with you. So I've had clients that have had amazing results that should have taken 12 weeks, but took 4 years because for the first 3 years they weren't ready. But like for them, it was a de-stress from work. It made them like at least were slightly accountable so they didn't get more out of shape and more overweight. And they enjoyed the time with me in the Tuesday, Thursday mornings or whenever they were training. So because I was there and I gave them the support, I gave them the accountability, I tried to set goals on the best that they were willing to accept, they knew I was there and ready. So when something did happen, when there was that pain point that made them go, enough's enough, they knew I was the person that was going to be there to support them, even if it meant that for 2 years, they were just my regular.
Yeah. That's such a good point. And funnily enough, I was speaking to that with Anthony, my colleague, yesterday about those longer term clients, and especially with like the expectation we have as coaches where you see a lot of coaches producing 12 16 week results consistently. When you've had a client for like 2 years, you're thinking, oh, should I have had this world class transformation with this person by now? It's been 2 years. Like, am I at? But actually, you're so right. Like, and I think a really good question to kind of ask yourself is like, is this client's quality of life better with me in it right now as their coach? And if the answer is yes, like, if they didn't coach with me, would they stop training altogether? If they didn't coach with me, would they have strayed way further with nutrition? Because sometimes it can really feel like you're not getting anywhere with a client. But I think it's also obviously really important to recognize how far would they regress without me. And it is sometimes difficult to answer that question because it's purely hypothetical. But yeah, I think you're so right. Those longer term clients can sometimes actually be the best clients as well. Like I've had some amazing long term clients that I've built relationships with.
And it comes down to expectation management as well. I think we get a lot of coaches that like get burnt out, frustrated, and feel that this client is taking all their energy. And I think there's one of two things that's happened here. Either the coach is hiding from the fact that they need to learn more about the service and they don't have enough strategies to help this person, so they're getting frustrated because their tools aren't working. Or, and I think it's often a more likely one, you haven't had a proper conversation of like, right, is this goal that's still something that you want? And if it's not, that's cool. I think if it's, I don't mind a client who goes, Simon, not for me. Like right now, like I've done all right. I want to be able to have a beer with the boys. Work's really busy. This is my priority right now. It's cool. Okay, let's set a performance goal. And like, even if we're not shooting for this big body composition goal that they may need, at least we're on the same path. Whereas I think you have often a lot of coaches have this conversation where, especially with the marketing of, you don't need to cut out any of the foods you love. You don't need to get rid of alcohol. You don't need to get rid of takeaways. You don't need to do cardio. You don't need to do this. It doesn't need to be hard. It needs to be sustainable. That we see coaches kind of go, client comes in, I want X result. And they go, oh, but I don't want to do the steps. Okay, you don't have to do the steps. Oh, but I want to make sure I have a free meal. Okay, you have a free meal. And at no point have you had the conversation that the result's going to be slower. So you have these clients thinking they're going to get X and you delivering a service that offers Y, and then you're frustrated that things aren't happening. And it's just because there's not a clear, this is what you need and this is the work you need to do. And I think if you've never been, and this is why I think that being there yourself is so important. If you've never been there yourself at least once, like I'll shout out Paul Standel. He did a great email the other day. It's like you've never been dick skin lean if you think it's all about calories. And I couldn't agree with that more.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's where so obviously we talk about educating our clients and building autonomy, self-efficacy and stuff. I think in reality, that's where that's built in. I think coaches misinterpret it. And when we say like, you need to educate your clients, they're thinking, right, I need to tell my client about moment arms and the change in, but that's not the case. What you're really trying to educate your client on is the consequences of their decisions. That's the education, that they understand that that's completely fine if you've not got the time, energy, or effort to give to this goal right now, but understand that this will be the consequence. You're not going to move as close towards it. And that's completely fine. No one's saying you have to do that, but you also need to accept that that is the outcome. That's the change. So yeah, I think that's a great point.
And it's only in the fitness world I really see this, right? Like if I want to learn guitar, but I didn't want to practice the guitar, I wouldn't ever fool myself into thinking that that's going to still happen, right? But we see it in the fitness space all the time, both from client and coach, where they think, well, if I do half the work that takes this person, like I want to look like that men's health cover model, but I don't want to do what he did to get there, and I still expect it. And I say that's the like. There's nothing. I always call it the Snickers bar analogy. There is nothing wrong with having a Snickers bar. You go, okay, I want a Snickers bar. Cool, that's 360 calories. We need to take out this much food for you to have the Snickers bar. What do you want? And they might go, yeah, I want the Snickers bar. Are you okay with being a bit hungry though? Because you will be. Yeah, fine, worth it. Or you might get client going, gotta take out all that food. Fuck that. It's not worth a Snickers bar. And then you're not the dictator telling client, do this, do that. You're just kind of going, right, here's the reality. And it's your life. Like, it was a great thing I heard. It's going to sound really harsh on him, but it's not. It's one of the... Reed Stafford. Do you know Reed? He used to work at M10.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Reed said to me once, he went, I don't give a fuck how they get 1% off as long as they get 1% off. And now, that sounded harsh. It sounded like he was driving his clients crazy. But he's like, look, I spent years, and I did this as well, trying to be optimal. I understood that increasing food volume or having the same amount of calories Monday through Friday and not having these big spikes and big low days as probably better for them in the long term. But until there's a priority, until there's a reason that makes them valuable, you can tell someone about sleep and the benefits of sleep all you like. And they're just clients going to go, yeah, all right, Jack, yeah, no worries, I'll do it, no problem. And they still don't do it because staying up later for them puts an extra 2 zeros on the bank balance. So if I can find a way to keep them progressing as much as possible and just keep drip feeding that education in there, at some point, if they're going really low calorie in the week and really high calorie on the weekend, and I have to bring my calories down Monday through Friday to account for their Saturday night, and I can keep getting them progressing, at some point they're going to tell me, oh, Simon, I really hate the fact that I can't progress in the gym. Do you know what? I hate how tired and hungry I am on a Wednesday. Now we have this desire to make, okay, well, let's suggest having a more steady state calorie intake throughout the 7 days. And it's like the client that's humming along until they get told they have diabetes and they change their life around. There has to be that desire change. And I think often with coaches, like, again, it's that expectation management. It's their journey, they run it, and you try and pull the pieces to make it work. And when they have something that changes their priorities, they may come back and have the other. Does that sort of make sense?
Yeah, definitely. So I've been toying with this kind of concept for a long time now. Obviously, we're both in the education space, like trying to help coaches with the stuff we've struggled with in the past. So when I first became a principle-based coach, where I was like, right, learn the principles first. So obviously for a fat loss client, we abide by a deficit. And however you can create that deficit is obviously going to help them achieve their result. And that kind of worked, but the issue was just being principle-based meant that I still needed to learn everything that would help the client create the deficit, which is the methods, right? And I think coaches now are so worried about using a method, whether it's low carb, high fat, low fat, high carb, or different Mediterranean diet, whatever. They're so terrified of using a method because methods now are condemned that they never get the result in the first place, because they're just telling their client calorie deficit. They're saying the principle, but they're never saying how to achieve it. And what you've just said there kind of resonated with that for me. Like when I started understanding not just methodologies, but where they were most appropriate, the context where they would apply, and then being able to apply them in the right scenarios, that was when I started really getting results. Because I could look at a client's food diary and go, well, clearly you love carbs and you don't really eat too much fatty food. So what if we applied a higher carb, lower fat approach within this deficit? Would that be something that you could stick to? And they were like, yep. And obviously, as we know, adherence is the biggest thing we need to achieve. So they were sticking to it and I was getting results. And I was like, oh, this is sick. Considering I'd previously learned that you shouldn't do this or you shouldn't do that. Well, in reality, it's what the client can do, not what you should and shouldn't do.
Yeah. And sometimes it's like, this is where I think you hit the nail on the head with the principles first thing. I think people bang on about calorie deficit, progressive overload, but never come up with strategies. And this is often why bodybuilding coaches have an advantage, because they learn things like skip loading and carb backloading and intermittent fasting approaches. And while you can go, well, Lane Norton says that intermittent fasting has no benefit over any other calorie deficit. Yeah, but if a client doesn't like breakfast, it could be the easy way for them to do it. Or if low carb is simple. You know, I sometimes look at some of these fad diets that everyone just shits on, and I go, well, they get more results than nearly every coach I know. I'm like, whether you like the approach or not, it's like, why? Because Slimming World is simple. Because Weight Watchers is simple. Because low carb is simple. So, like, your clients aren't going to develop an emotional eating issue and their thyroid's not going to burst into flames if you take out carbs for a little period of time. But it could be the thing that makes it go, right, I can manage a restaurant without pulling out my Fitness Pal. And if you're dealing with these busy people, then it might not be the perfect plan that I would give them, but right now, they're not going to listen to me if I give them the perfect macro split. It might overwhelm them by saying, here's every food in the world, go nuts. If I can go, right, okay, well, let's start low carb. We can get the basics in place. And then we can just layer on more and more as we go through this process. Same thing with like keto. Like, yeah, okay, keto works from a calorie deficit perspective. People might not adhere to it if they like carbohydrates, but people often go on ketogenic diets and truly get into ketosis, often manage hunger a lot better. So like giving somebody Ozempic, if when you're having your coaching calls, they're not going, I'm starving, they're more likely to open up and listen to training modalities and the activity stuff and small treats to diet because they can be present. And like, again, if you don't look and understand what goes under the hood in these diets and the pathways, you just say calorie deficit, it doesn't matter, then you might be missing out on so many tools in your toolbox because you don't understand when these things are applicable and when these things could work.
Love that.
But this brings me on to a topic, just because I think this is one I know we differ on, and that is meal plans, yay or nay.
Interesting. So I will say from the start that, like, I am also insured to prescribe. It depends what you're saying, right? Because are we talking like example meal plans or definitive prescribed meal plans?
Well, I think the thing with this question, right? Who actually gives a definitive prescribed meal plan? Like, I will write a meal plan up for a client, and I'll be like, "This is what I recommend you follow." But at the end of the day, it's your life. I'm not prescribing anything, right? This fits your calories. This fits the food you like. This fits the approach of this. Where fits where your health markers are. But you can decide to do this on Doritos if you want. It's your life. I think coaches get caught up, and I know you're not, but I think coaches get caught up in this. I'm not insured to as a scapegoat for I don't want to do the work to give the client what they need to simplify the process.
Yes.
It's easier just to put something into a calorie calculator and here's the numbers and I'll see you next week.
Yes. Very true. Very true. I think that's it, isn't it? It's like the whole debate around it, and this is the issue with social media soundbites. The issue is that it's an either or, and it's never like all the gray area in between. Because I'm a massive fan of meal plans where they have a time and a place to help, like you said, simplify the process to a client. The thing I'm not a fan of, and this was actually because obviously you'll have seen my reel on this. This was actually generated off the back of a client I received who had a previous coach who only prescribed them meal plans, who I know isn't insured to prescribe them meal plans, but definitively gave them a meal plan and said, if you stray from this, you're not going to get the result and I'm not going to change anything about it, like blah, blah, blah. Limiting contact with the client because he had hundreds of clients, like, so it's really a pitfall of kind of that coach's ethics, I guess. So the thing that I witnessed with this client is that when they were going out on like social meals, they were like, Jack, I have no idea how to do this. They'd literally had a coach before and they were like, I have no idea how to approach this social meal. And that was like red flags for me because obviously that coach, like you said, had just not put in any work to help that client grow and develop and manage their goals. So yeah, aside from those coaches, I'm not a big fan of those. If you do give a meal plan for the purpose of, this is how your plan would fit into a day of eating. This is an example of what it would look like. Obviously, the protein choices are interchangeable, but try and kind of stick close to the targets. I don't think there's anything really wrong with that. And many people need that visual representation anyway, right?
Yeah, I would say that as well. I think as much as it may be a red flag when someone just gives a meal plan, say never stray from it, I also think it's a red flag when people just give macros, but it almost gets a pass. And like, I see so many coaches going, meal plans don't teach you anything. And I'm like, they teach you structure, they teach you portion size, they teach you food volume, they teach you so many things. It's like the same person that says meal plans don't teach you anything. Well, why do you give training plans? Why don't you just give total tonnage numbers and say we want to be inclusive with every exercise and not like demonize any? So you pick your exercises, total tonnage. But no one would. And I think this thing of like keeping things simple, what we need, what often happens when clients, and we talk about this as push and pull motivation, right? If someone, they'll move, they're great at making someone lose the first 5 pounds, but not the last 5 pounds. Now, we can talk about urgency and pull motivation all we like, but what happens as people lose focus? What do people fall back on in those times of focus? And if you can have the break glass in emergency meal plan, that is like, right, if I've got the same sort of diet every day that I almost got such autopilot now that I can fall back on it, it's going to have a much higher success rate than someone saying, well, here's 500 anabolic sandwich recipes and here's your macro numbers. Because like when life gets busy, there's no way they're keeping that up. I'm not making low carb carbonara every day. And I don't think they're necessarily, there's a time and a place of recipes if clients like it. But to me, it's very much you want to learn Spanish? Just go to Marbella. As opposed to, here's an app that will teach you it sentence by sentence.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And as well, I want to bring up the relationship with food thing because I agree with that massively is people presume that, this method creates disordered eating or eating disorders, when in reality, that was probably already underlying for that person. And really the meal plan would have just brought that out. And I'll use my own case as like a bit of an example here because the first photo shoot I did if it fits your macros approach to it. And I had a far worse relationship with food than my second and third shoot where I used a rigid meal plan. And I generated my own meal plan, don't get me wrong, but and I would with a client, if I was going to use a meal plan, I would democratically create it with them. You know, what foods do you enjoy? We'll kind of build those in and stuff like that. But ironically, for me, my worst relationship with food I've had so far in this industry has been off if it fits your macros, which is supposed to be the one that gives people flexibility and choice. So yeah, it's ironic.
Do you think a lot of this talk at the moment, 'cause I see this more and more with coaches, do you think a lot of, because the coaches have a bad relationship with food, maybe through photo shoots and bodybuilding preps, they automatically assume that their clients are going to have it? Because like, don't get me wrong, I've had clients that come in that have questionable relationship with food, normally through bad coaching experiences. But 90%, I would say, of the clients I've had in my career aren't scared of carbs. They eat too many carbs. They could potentially need more restriction. They eat too many crisps. They're not scared of crisps. And I feel that sometimes like people confuse meal plans, but it has to be bodybuilder pro fish and a rice cake. It's like a meal plan is just some sort of structure to follow. This could be as dialed in clean or as if it fits your macro style as you like. But I think so many coaches, because they have this relationship, they're trying to say that to their audience. And it's not actually true. More people need simplicity than they need complex things to make sure that they don't get scared of a cheesecake.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think, you know, nutrition's probably not the only example of coaches projecting their own problems on their clients. And I think this is actually where, because I always go through these fleeting moments of like self-development and self-growth, and, you know, you read 3 books in a row and then you don't read any for 6 months and so on and so forth. But I think they're really where the coach needs to kind of make sure they're doing their own level of personal development. Like if they're not looking inwards and making sure they're not projecting their own insecurities on their clients, that's incredibly important, because no one ever gets taught that. And even now in the education space, no one gets taught that. I wrote down a list before this podcast. I wrote down a list of like what I really needed to learn as a coach, and, you know, the courses I've done and stuff like that. And very rarely am I seeing coaches study leadership, motivational interviewing and behavior change, communication, teaching, the things that actually we do probably more than we do training and nutrition. Like these elements of, you know, like building relationships and stuff like that. And I think a lot of that comes from because the coach has this expectation that they really only need to learn training and nutrition. And that is true. You know, that's our job. We kind of need to know those things. But much like a professor in a university, like knowing something and being able to teach it back to that person are 2 totally separate things. And people now mistake this idea that just because you know something means that somehow you know how to teach it back to that person. It definitely doesn't. And I learned that the hard way coming into the education space. I realized, I actually need to invest more in my teaching and my presentation, because that's the thing I was actually relatively unskilled at. And it kind of goes back to then this question, like, are coaches projecting their insecurities and their problems on their clients? And I would say yes, for the most part, but it's also because they're not self-educating on the other areas of coaching. They're only educating on training and nutrition.
Yeah, this is why when coaches join SMU, I'm very much a big fan of, like, there is when everyone studies, they just do this deep study, like read an anatomy textbook and hope stuff goes in. But I always think there's an active study component where you go and watch John Shallow teach a shoulder press, or watch someone talk to a client on a YouTube video, and then it's like play. And that could be write a program, write a template, get in the gym and play with stuff. And because I think it's tricky, right? Because again, there's a middle ground here. I think the more I learn about functional nutrition, the more I learn about training modalities, gives me a better ability. The underpinning of it, as much as these things are tools and important, I understand it. The understanding allows me to be a better motivational interviewer, because I can understand the triggers and the symptoms, and I know the direction to go in. So I can stop and have a relaxed conversation with my client. I mean, like, how are things? What's going on? What are you struggling with? What do you need more help with? And with not being in the back of my head always thinking about what my next question is, because I need to find the next strategy. I understand the broad picture now. I can relax into conversations rather than being on scarcity mode. So I do think that's important. And I do think more people maybe need to improve their communication skills. But on the flip side, I've now started to see this trend. And again, this is why I think the education space from a training and nutrition standpoint, it's going to come back around. But I think we're going to go into a real dark period of this, because coaches, it's easier to pass off responsibility than it is to learn the stuff and admit that you don't know stuff. And I'm seeing a lot more now communication leadership courses from people that don't understand training and nutrition. So they're communicating on people, but they still don't understand strategy. Like, people also don't talk training in their check-ins. And I think the underpinning of any good coach should be a real understanding of the craft. Like, it's one of the things I love from RTS is our job is to apply forces to anatomy. So it's like, if you don't understand forces and you don't understand anatomy, right? Don't get me wrong, being able to communicate with the thing is the thing that makes those forces and that anatomy work. But you can't communicate shit if you don't actually understand the thing you're trying to teach in the first place. And again, I go into both. I think they're hugely important, but I think we shouldn't skip that first step either, because the underpinning of being able to have good communication is understanding the craft to begin with, I would think.
Definitely. Yeah, definitely. And I think great courses tend to do that. It's really the shorter courses that aren't really covering that ground. Like, most fantastic courses will do that. Obviously, we've both learned from Integra. We know that Michael deep dives into some stuff hard, and you start learning about physics that you've never thought you'd try and learn before. But he does pull it back, and is like, guys, let's take a break. Let's cover communication with the client, and it feels like, oh, that's interesting. But he covers
Michael is the best educator, and myself included. So Michael is the best educator on the planet. Yeah. And I sit there and I go, I sit and have a session with Michael, and I'm like, I've now been educating for 8 years. So I've been a PT for 14, been educated for 8. I've done 2 group lectures minimum with coaches per week for 8 years. I've mentored hundreds of them, and I'm sitting there and I still find myself sometimes just trying to over-explain my points, and Michael never does. It is always like, I tell him I ask him a question I know he knows the answer to, and he never, ever, ever gives me an answer. It's like, I don't know, maybe. I'm like, gosh, you leave a session with Michael feeling unbelievable. And I think if anyone wants to, again, in this, not to call Michael out, but like, Michael's not this big jacked 6'4" bodybuilder looking dude. Do not sell Michael Goulden short, because he's probably I think he's one of the best to do it in the industry by far. So moving on to training, because we do see coaches, as you said earlier on, it's them they go to people that are necessarily more in shape themselves, which leads them into bodybuilding coaches, and they train Gen Pop. So what can a coach get wrong training a Gen Pop client learning from bodybuilders?
Just to double check I'm going on the right angle here, are we also going to talk about what they get right?
We'll go into that for sure.
Okay, cool. What they get wrong?
Just lots.
Yeah. So, in my opinion, it tends to be lack of individualization. It's a lot of parallel in their own programs. So, I'm going to give my client what I got from my coach. So, they're giving 50-year-old Susan, these drop sets or cluster sets, and not taking into account that she's had a pretty stressed day at work, and they might need to auto regulate that session depending on how the client comes into the session and stuff like that. It's really all the humanistic elements that I wouldn't tend to expect finding from a bodybuilding coach. And that's not to say that's a bad thing in any way. It's just a bodybuilding coach is typically built a business off, you come into my business, you do as I say, and you're going to get a good result. And that's cool. That's
and most of them
fine.
Do.
Yeah, for sure. But let's be honest, Gen Pop clients, you kind of have to dance with them to get them to the point where they want the result themselves, or they find the result that they actually want. And these guys are coming into the gym and they don't love training. So believe it or not, you can't give them the same programming that you received, because they hate training. In fact, they feel low on energy all the time. And there's all these other things you need to account for.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And I think as well as I think what's brilliant, and I know I'm jumping the gun on my next question, because I'm generally, I think, more of a positive guy than a negative guy. What's brilliant about learning from bodybuilders is that you take these concepts of what works with people that really apply them, right? So let's look at things like resting heart rate, HRV. Resting heart rate is quite easy now, but like HRV, blood pressure, blood glucose, right? And like these are great tools, and these are tools I might pull out of my toolbox if a client asks about it, intrigued about it, or has a specific issue that it's worth going to this extra level of complexity. But we also see a lot of coaches do one of two things. They get this bodybuilder approach and they send people these 400 data things to check. And you'll either get a coach going, I only work with beginners. And they don't track anything then, which is really bad because they're overwhelmed by it themselves. Or they'll give the client that. And their client's checking HRV and you don't know how to interpret it. And I'm like, I think the brilliant thing about learning for bodybuilders is I'm going to learn all of this stuff. Like, because I think learning that stuff for me has helped me with my Gen Pop clients so much, but not by tracking those data points. It's like, right, what are the signs and symptoms the client can tell me in their own experience and from the words they use and from how the demeanor on profile and what the training logs are doing? How can I tell when I'm pushing them too hard? And what do I do in that result when I am pushing them too hard? When do I pull back? When do I put my foot on the gas? But I go, right, how do I scale this back to working with Susan? The principles are the same. The application of how I do that, because if I showed Susan the bodybuilding plan, she wouldn't even get started.
Love that. Love that. Yeah, I would totally agree. It becomes almost... It's kind of, you tend to find with Gen Pop clients, there's a lot more subjective markers to track, and also your interpretation of what that means when they're tracking them. Because I've had clients where, I've used scales of 10 and rate your stress, and they've put 5 out of 10, and you're like, okay, cool, 5 out of 10, and you're interpreting that in your head. But then you say, okay, what does that mean? Is that high for you, or is that relatively low? And they're like, oh yeah, that's basically nothing, because they've obviously come to know that they exist basically between 5 and 10, and they never drop below 5 because they're so stressed all the time. So I think our interpretation of that data is really important. But yeah, Gen Pop clients is a lot more subjective stuff, not really as many objective measures. We obviously still do things like blood pressure very, very often, because that tends to be a massive issue with Gen Pop clients, but that's not something we inherently need to go to the nth degree about with them. It's just something we know when we're building the programs, and then obviously we can advise them that that's pretty high. Here's some things we're going to do to counteract it. They don't really need to know what that means. They don't need to know the definitions of systolic and diastolic blood pressure. It doesn't matter. But yeah,
I think you hit the nail on the head. And when you're looking at things like data points, a great tip, by the way, I learned from Luke Hoffman, from formerly of Muscle Mentors, now of some sort of film and TV YouTube channel, which actually is really good. But he always said, do a score of 7, because you can't be on the fence. You can't be 5, or you can't be 3 out of 5. You can't be 5 out of 10. You have to be slightly good or slightly shit. And the great thing about that, and going into the autonomy, I always say to clients when tracking data, if you score less than halfway, I want you to write a note telling me what the issue was. So we all know stress could be sleep, it could be anxiety, it could be depression, it could be a bad day at work. We know digestion could be heartburn, constipation, bloating, farting, burping, with all the gross stuff that we can go into there. If they can start to be aware of what that is, and we can then start to them realizing that's better, because a lot of clients who go, and this is sometimes why I quite like, and I don't always do it with Gen Pop because it's overwhelming, I quite like health assessment forms. Like the scores of like, how often do you go to loo? How often do you burp in a day? Do you find yourself like often, frequently? Because how many people go, oh, my digestion's fine, but they think shitting once every 3 weeks is normal. They think feeling like crap is their best. So be able to notice those trends. But I think certainly the way you do check-ins is so different from a Gen Pop client, because we start looking at, if a bodybuilder comes in, as you said, they've got people that they follow the plan, and they do follow the plan. So we know that Steve's calories are Steve's calories, and we know if they're not moving, he's in a deficit. We know if he's experiencing symptoms that are signs of low thyroid, there's probably a good reason to kind of go, can we look at some blood work here? Can we make sure can we pull back here? Whereas with Gen Pop, they could have had 4 nights poor sleep. They could have been on the piss. They could have had a stressful day at work. The kids could have kept them up all night. We also can look at things like, what's the reason why most people aren't losing weight? It's probably not because cortisol has stolen all the gains, in which I see coaches when they learn these bodybuilding courses and they go, oh, it must be thyroid, it must be cortisol, it must be insulin. Well, it's probably the fact that they don't realize that lattes have calories. and they don't understand oil, or if I nick the chips off my partner's plate, it's not my calories, or they don't want to tell you about the cookies. So like questions that you'll never get on a bodybuilding check-in form, like how many meals out have you had? Have you weighed all your portion sizes? Like, these are questions that like you won't even get. And that's where I get a lot of coaches coming to me and go, this client's not moving. And I'll go, have you ever get them to take pictures of their meals? And they're like, no. And I'm like, do it. And a week later, they're always like, oh my God, they've lost 4 pounds. I was like, well, because they were under-reporting their calories. And that's the stuff with Gen Pop that you need to dial in with more through motivational interviewing and through the questions you ask, more than what's the HRV this morning?
Yeah, love that. And I always kind of coined it as unconditional trust. Like a lot of younger coaches, for me included, when I was a younger coach, like I would go into that coaching relationship with unconditional trust that the client was doing everything that they were telling me they were doing. And I would never really pick it apart because I would assume that they knew what I knew, rather than realizing their education is like, it's down here. So they're telling you their truth of it. They're telling you what they genuinely believe. And they're not trying to, hide anything from you. But they've also missed a hell of a lot of things that, the more educated person would understand and would track. And like you said, liquid calories, hidden calories here, scanning a barcode and then realizing the products that's come up isn't the same thing as what they've actually scanned. Just simple things that we would actually realize that they don't realize it. And I think that's the next step, is because I always learned that from Mike McDonald from MNU, was he always said, clients will lie to you. First thing you should always go to, the client's going to lie to you. So when I learned that, my next kind of growth as a coach was trying to learn to not take offense, because they're not lying to you always purposefully, but they're just not telling you the whole truth of it. And that's the difference. Because at first I always used to interpret it like, oh, this person's choosing to lie to me about, and they're hiding things from me. And in reality, it's not. They're just not telling the truth of what happened, which is not the same thing.
And it's also, it's like, I've done this with dieting when I've worked with coaches, and you have a bit of food that takes over your calories, and you and ah whether you tell it. And eventually, most of the time, you probably do, because you're a coach and you know what it feels like on the other end. But it's not a personal thing. It's more of a self-preservation thing. It's more of if anything, it's more of a compliment to them, because like I want to show that I'm doing what I'm saying I'm doing. I don't want to let this person down. And like, I always look at it like it's the biggest thing is not to be condescending. I feel this is a big thing in the fitness space, both from coaches being condescending to the clients about what you mean you don't know that it's the amount of protein in the chicken, not the weight of the chicken. Like, well, they don't know. If I walked into an accountancy firm, right? Like, if I walked into an accountancy firm, I'm not going to understand how their systems work, but they can do it in their sleep. And I wouldn't want to be judged for not knowing, because I've never walked into an accountancy firm. They've never opened up My Fitness Pal before. They don't know what the calories are. They don't know these rules. You've been taught it. It's the same in the education space. I see a lot of educators, certainly in the exercise mechanics world. If you don't know the internal momentum of the vastus lateralis, then you should be working with people. I'm like, piss off, mate. You didn't know it yourself one day. So it's, I look at the stuff like that. It's like, they might be consciously lying to you, but there's a guilt. And that's your job to find out and ask those questions and get them to be in a comfortable position and then maybe you can flip the switch, like we said about earlier on. Okay. I always say to my clients early on, I don't want perfection. I want accuracy. I don't care if you had a glass of wine. I just don't want you to put 0.3 of a glass of wine. I don't care if you had a massive steak. I just don't want you to put 1 ounce of a steak. Because at least then we might go, well, let's look at this. You're on 5,000 calories. We're overeating. What do you want to get rid of? And I would say, I would recommend getting rid of X, Y, and Z. And they go, no, but I want my wine. Okay, well, what else are you willing to get rid of? And then we find this diet that is that sweet spot between what does your health need and what do you enjoy? But that comes from the open and honesty, and it comes from asking those right questions. And again, it's mistakes. Like, so it's like, how do you start to be able to piece those together? And those, I think, like, if you look at people like R&T are a great example of this, right? When Akash looks at, you look at Akash's check-in forms, and I saw Akash's check-in form for R&T existed, and they've obviously developed since then. It's less about what's, total tonnage for the week. And although I do that, it's slightly different, but it's not advanced things. It's how many meals out were there? Have you weighed your portions? Getting some food pictures. It's this stuff. It's like, look, we understand the people we work with. I'll worry about that complicated stuff later. Let's just make sure they've got the basics in place. So going into, what do your coaches get right about learning from bodybuilders? I've alluded to something, but I didn't get your take. What do you think we get right from learning from bodybuilders?
I think they get intensity, which is obviously a huge component. I love that myself personally, because I know I've seen many coaches that, obviously, I mean, both being in facilities where training hard was kind of like an expectation and a culture. I always saw a huge trend in consistency between clients that wanted to train hard and would kind of take some of those attributes outside of the gym as well. And you would often find that the clients that wanted the longer rest periods, that didn't want to push themselves as hard, struggled in those moments of instant gratification outside of the gym as well. And bodybuilding coaches get that right. They understand that to make change, you need to apply pressure, and training intensity is exactly that. So yeah, I would say that's a huge one.
Do you think intensity is more important than volume? Like, if you had to pick one for a beginner client, and obviously you do an element of both, which lever are you pushing first?
What kind of definition of intensity are we using now?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked that question. I'm not looking at percentage of 1 rep max here. I'm looking at intensity as proximity to failure.
Okay, cool. I personally would say 9 times out of 10 intensity, although when they do start out, I am pushing the volume game, but I'm really looking at how I can get them as close to intensity as soon as possible. Done well, obviously.
But you're pushing the volume game. You're pushing the volume game because they come in not being able to do the intensity game. And your aim is to, I presume, by the standings, for them to do less overall volume and do more very, very tailored, hard, specific work.
Eventually, yeah.
Yes. Yeah. I would absolutely agree with you with this. I think there's a lot of the research that's coming out. If you see Menno Henselmann's page, and not slate Menno Henselmann, that we were seeing these push towards higher volume trainings being better for hypertrophy. And a lot of coaches are running with this. And I understand that. I don't think it's a bad way of looking at it. Maybe online coaching, because again, you're not in control of the intensity as much. But if I said to Jordan Peters, do 25 sets of chest per week, he'd fall to bits, because you can get so much from one. So we think of the overall systemic fatigue that's going to come from those volumes, the harder someone trains. I think you can either train more or you could do it harder. You can't do both. And if you've got clients that are only training 2 to 3 times a week, you better train pretty damn hard if you want to get those same results. And if you don't want to train hard, then you've got to accept that you're probably going to have to train 6 days a week to get that stimulus. And I always take research like that with a huge pinch of salt, because I think when you look at the people that are probably doing these studies, I would like to see like how much do are monitoring training intensity. We're looking at research that don't know how to train hard. They go, well, they said they were at 1 rep in reserve. And you know from working with clients, what they think is 1 rep in reserve, what actually 1 rep in reserve is vastly different. So I would look at this, okay, well, have you come to these conclusions that higher volumes are better for hypertrophy? Because 90% of the people that you use for this study weren't training anywhere close to failure. Then we took that same cohort of really hard Mike Mensa enthusiasts. We find very different outcomes in this research.
Yeah. I love that. And I think that's where, critical thinking is super huge, because Menno Henselmann, he posts some great stuff sometimes, but obviously he's trying to stay so consistently up to date with the research that's coming out that he's really just expressing like, this is kind of what we can kind of maybe take from this study. And I'm reading some of them sometimes and I'm like, yeah, but did they do this, this, and this, and this? Or did they do this, this, and this? And I think that's that critical thinking element is super, super important, because I know it's always fun to ask these questions of like, right, well, if you could choose either or in an ideal world, which would you choose? But it's never really an either or in real life, is it? It's always, okay, what can that person give me? And it typically sits like on that sliding scale, like you said, whether it's time available to train, or whether it's their mental fortitude in being able to push themselves to that intensity, or whether it's their enjoyment in training intensity. Some clients just don't love that feeling, and actually to make their day better, it might not be to take them to absolute failure on that hack squat. You know, like if they're going back to work at a desk and they don't want to return absolutely stressed to the nines, like it's always these kinds of contexts. And I think that's where the ability to critically think about that client in particular and go, can I challenge even my own biases at this moment in time to create the best outcome for this person? Like, can I do that? And I love thinking that way.
Yeah. I agree with that. And I always think I love the Luke Lehman impression. He admitted to me on our guest lecture the other day that he didn't get it. It wasn't his saying. I can't remember who said it was. So I apologize if I'm not giving credit to the right person, but I learned it from Luke of being evidence informed rather than evidence based. So like we look at evidence as a bell curve and we're saying, right, this is what works for the majority of people. So for sake of argument, right, that, let's say, I don't know, seed oils aren't bad for us, for example, or artificial sweeteners aren't affecting us on the bell curve. But you wouldn't tell someone with a nut allergy, well, they're healthy and research shows most people do well with nuts, so shut up, eat your nuts. But if someone has issues, let's say a Michaela Peterson with seed oils and preservatives and pesticides and toxins, well, are you telling me they're wrong because that isn't? If we understand people on the bell curve here, does not mean your client doesn't fall outside of that bell curve. We've also got to understand with training studies in particular, who signs up to training studies? People enjoy training. I would sign up to a training study. Steve, who hates the gym, is not going to go, oh, I'm going to do that bench press study down the university. So we don't necessarily get the complete picture. It's being able to take that little bit with a pinch of salt. So if we are assuming here with both of us to push the intensity lever first, again, on a spectrum, how do we help clients, or how can coaches help clients learn what 1 to 2 reps in reserve actually is, in person and online?
Definitely, I think, and that's where, as we'd probably both agree, that gym floor experience is so valuable. You can't even put a price on that. And really, even my perception of proximity to failure has changed over time, you know, from where I thought I used to train hard to then stepping into M10, running practical camps where we were literally taking people to just crazy levels of almost like modified failure, where you were basically assisting most of the load off them at this point, to then learning from Jack Taylor, who, talks about failure as being, well, actually, what do we just want that last rep to look like? And rather than it have to be a mechanical failure, is it just a slight change in position, or is it a change in speed, or is it this, or is it that? And I really like that definition. Me and Ant use that one all the time now, because that's probably my favorite perception of it. But how do we translate that back to a client, especially a Gen Pop client? Well, I think time and experience and their motivation, and in reality, you're probably not going to get that same outcome on like most exercises. But if you can maybe lock into one where they really enjoy that exercise, you're probably more likely to be able to showcase to them what that proximity to failure looks like, right? But if a client hates that exercise, good luck trying to take them to failure on it. You're battling probably more than they are to actually take them to failure at that point. So yeah, I think that's an important point.
I think the question I always asked when I was working on the gym floor was, if someone said I hate an exercise, like, do you hate it because you hate it, or do you hate it because it's hard? Because whatever I replace it with is also going to be hard. Yeah. So if it's just that you just don't like that it's hard, then get back in. But if you don't like it because you actually hate it, then we can find another thing to do that same thing. There's like nothing off limits. And some of the big things for me is, one, never assuming anyone's an intermediate. Always be happy to regress. And if you want to be able to push someone for a hypertrophy response, which if the goal is hypertrophy, it is a intensity and fatigue game, right? Whereas dieting is generally a activity and nutrition game. So I'm going to find exercises that allow me to do that. A back squat, right? No matter whether you love or hate a back squat, and we can talk about the mechanics of that for hours. Who's really comfortable pushing a back squat to failure? Like really crazy bastards and no one else. So let's go to a hack. Let's go to a pendulum. Let's go to a leg press, right? Or like being able to put people in stable things where they can only think about one thing. The force they can exert is going to help them. And I also think a challenge set. With beginners, this is what I always do. Now, let's say we do 3 sets of 10. First set, how many reps have you got left in the tank? And he goes, 2. Okay, cool. Next set, How many? 1. Right. Last set on every exercise is go as many as you can. Because people go, oh, well, you don't want to go to absolute failure with beginners because they won't recover. But those first 2 sets are technically advanced warm-ups for the most part because they don't know. They're not going to impact recovery from doing 1 hard set per exercise. So there's no harm in really pushing them on those stable exercises to go balls to the wall. And what they thought was 1 might have been 8. Okay, so we'll up the weight next time. What we thought was 1 now is 5. We'll up the weight next time. And when we get to the point where we hit that failure point, eventually when we get to, okay, this is a 1, 2, they know it. And then we can run with that until they're struggling to recover. Oh, okay, well, let's pull back a rep. But you learn where the end is before we then start to pull back and find where reps in reserve are. I think we move to it too quickly. And again, coaches are too trusting. They assume their clients can do it. Another thing I've played around with online is using concentric speed. So again, like I would visually show concentric speed. But sometimes like I'll say to a client, like, and again, it's hard to properly manipulate this, but if you're counting in your head, you don't stop the rep until you get a 5-second concentric. No one's going to deliberately slow down a rep to gamify this and to fake it, right? They're going to speed up. So it's like when you can't help but make it 5 seconds on the way up, that's when you stop. And then that teaches them, oh, okay, that's what that feels like. And then you can take away the restraints and just let them go. Is there any other things like that you use with clients that help them see what it is?
I love that. Some of the stuff you mentioned there as well is so applicable to, what you can actually use on the gym floor. Because I think, I would agree that using visual demonstrations, but setting almost the parameters of what that looks like, I think is incredibly important. I think, just doubling down on what you said about stability is going to be a vital component and something that obviously you can only really pick up when you're on the gym floor. But having a client in a seated leg curl, we can both assume straight away what those compensatory movement patterns are going to be like compared to a lying leg curl, compared to a leg extension, compared to this and that. So choosing the exercises that the ability to minimize compensatory movements is going to be very, very useful. Changes in speed patterns, definitely. But aside from that, honestly, I think time just needs to be a huge factor. Like, let's be honest, even if we got absolutely beasted in our first year of training, we could both agree that year 3 of training was better and year 5 of training was better. And I think that's just where time, consistency, and being able to make sure the client repeatedly turns up to the gym is super important. Like maximizing longevity for that client is going to be vital, because you can try and nail training efficacy all right, perfect example is like phasing for a client, right? The first at least 4 weeks, but let's be honest, for Gen Pop clients, it's more like 10 or 12 of that first phase is skill acquisition in the gym. It's teaching them how to move and contract tissue and apply force to their body without changing every other variable. And that's kind of from a lifetime training viewpoint, it's kind of the same. Like year 1 really is skill acquisition, it's play, it's learning your feel of the gym floor. And I think that's what we forget with clients, is because we're so focused on driving an outcome all the time, we don't often consider the longevity of, well, maybe a little bit of play is important for them, and training intensity for that result is so important, so important. But can we also mix it with a little bit of play? Like you said about the feeder sets or the warm-up sets, can some of those be play? Can 40 minutes of our 1 hour session be really intense training and then like 20 minutes be play, so that we can maximize longevity? Because I know if I'm training this client in 3 years' time, their training is going to be so much better anyway,
I love that. And I think, as you say, like, if you're building, let's say, for most coaches, you're going to be doing some sort of full body GBC with most beginners, right? You got your A's and your B series, which are your big main movement patterns. And then your C series, like, while you can get super opt on about it and be like, right, what's the target areas? What's the biggest things from a physique standpoint, from a prehab standpoint, from a remedial standpoint? And we can drive these. But like, if I train you progressively hard on pull downs, rows, bench presses, or some form of machine press, hack squats, leg curls, RDLs, you're not going to have worse arms in 3 years. So if you wanted to do a Jefferson curl, if you wanted to work on some mobility stuff, like, it's not going to be, unless you came to me and go, I want the biggest arms in the world, then yes, okay, we'll spend more time doing bis and tris. But like, you can play around with there. There's not a pressure of Like every second has to be completely dialed in with this. And on that note, like, do you think there's still a place for the compound barbell lifts in body composition goals?
Definitely. I've got clients doing that right now that they challenge my bias so much, to be honest. Like I came from a body, I'm not saying I was any good at it and I never competed, but I came from a bodybuilding background. I was fascinated by it. I loved hypertrophy training. And I came to understand that hypertrophy training was typically maximized by, being able to maximize force production on certain movements, right? So choose the movements where you can produce the most force and load into that. And obviously we know for 90% of people, barbell squats aren't really that. But I've got 2 clients at the moment in particular, one that just loves barbell squats. And to be honest, she can squat better than me. The other, I set her up and she was like, cool, I'll send a gym walkthrough, recorded her gym, and it's just dumbbells, squat rack, squat rack, squat rack, and that's it. And I could do one of 2 things. I could go, wow, that's not very optimal, we're gonna have to find you another gym, or we could do what's most appropriate for that client in that moment, which is, let's assess your squat, let's see how it looks. If we're happy with it, can we choose positions, changing the loading for the center of mass, put you in the best possible position to do that without risking injury, or, to at least get some outcome that we're looking for, wedge the heels, etc. And we've done that. And, over time she'll get better at it. And it just becomes one of those things, because like you say, if it's a body composition goal, unless they're turning around saying, I want optimal muscle development, in which that's a different thing. But she's like, I'm dieting for my wedding in 12 weeks time, then yeah, it's an energy balance game. I just need to keep her in the gym without getting hurt. That's the main thing. It's an energy balance game to lose fat.
Yeah. I when you look at that word optimal as well, right? Like, define that. Because like I had a 5-hour mentorship with Tom Hibbert, and if you know Tom Hibbert from Winning Strength, he's a strongman guy. But I said, first question I asked, well, tell me everything you know about hypertrophy. What is the best periodization model for hypertrophy? How do you run it? Everything like this. And he just said to me, he went, the best hypertrophy program is the one the clients enjoy enough to train hard enough for long enough. I'm like, right, I've got 4 hours and 55 minutes left. I need other questions now. We just start talking about strength. But it really hit home in the sense of like one, like we can make this perfect bodybuilder plan, but if there's no progression there's no long-term thing, if they can't chat around the dinner table about what's your bench, right? Are they going to stick with it? Are they going to start program hopping? Are they going to hate it? Right? And hypertrophy is a much longer, much more patience-orientated game. That should be more of the consideration rather than what is the perfect exercise for me right now, that we sometimes get with the exercise mechanic world. Like, how do I add more bands to then a sex swing? And I'm like, let's do something we can set up quickly and go, and let they enjoy and they can get into it. Like, I think with it comes to like the barbell lifts, like how old are you, Jack?
29.
29, right? So you haven't hit the menopause 30s yet, right? So this is going to happen soon, where that love for bodybuilding in your early 30s will just start to dissipate a bit. And this is where you see everyone in the 30s start doing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, right? And I fought it in my 20s all the time. And now I'm like, should I do BJJ? And what you realize with that is, like, most of your clients are in the 30s. Yeah, they say they want to build muscle because that's what social media tells them. And yes, they would like to look better naked with their shirt off. But what they really mean is, I want to be able to have a beer after the dieting phase and not get fat. So when I leaned into the exercise mechanics world, and I didn't learn it from Michael directly originally, I learned it from people who were 3-4 ranks down. Like, Simon, you're not built to squat. So I just pendulum squatted. But eventually, it's like, once you stick a load of plates on a pendulum squat, it's still cool, and you've got big quads, but it's like, it's not my only goal in life. My movement got worse, my skill got worse. And the great thing about the compound barbell lifts is there are skill components to this. I can progress and perfect a barbell squat or a deadlift or an overhead press for the next 20 years. It's not just about load. I can get really into it. Like I would get into playing the piano or the guitar or shuffling a deck of cards if I'm a magician. And I think like, we get so locked in on how do we make this program optimal that we forget, look, there's about 6-7 exercises in this program. We could have a skill-based start that isn't quote unquote optimal for you. It won't build you the biggest quads, but that could be, we could use that for enjoyment, and then we could put a hack squat in. And if their back squat's going up, then we probably know the hack squat's doing a good job, and that's the indicator. You know, like when we talk about play, is that some of the stuff that you take into consideration?
Definitely. I think that was so well articulated. And I think in reality, it's just because I think as I've kind of grown more mature with this, I can look back and see where I've kind of gone right and gone wrong and stuff. But we forget because it's so long since we first started training, we forget what those first few years felt like and what really kept us in the gym when everyone else stopped going. You know, and a lot of the stuff that kept us in the gym wasn't optimal stuff. It wasn't, you know, matching resistance profiles or, you know, changing the loading pattern on something. It made us feel more confident. We enjoyed it. We kind of felt part of a community and maybe included in something bigger than ourselves. And there was an element of progression. Great. Can we do that for a client in a way that, you know, builds their enjoyment, but also gets a result of some kind, and that they can kind of see? And I don't believe everyone should do something that they can see doing for the rest of their life, because like you said, bodybuilding was a phase. It was just a thing that we did, and we stopped doing it eventually. That's fine. But that's kind of what we're trying to cultivate for ourselves and our clients a lot of the time, is that's where the play comes in, is because it builds in the longevity, because no one's getting a result if they're not sticking to it for long enough.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that. And I think then that's where I think the RTS sort of movement, and it's not the RTS as the company, it's not a Tom Purvis or a Michael Goulden issue, it's the RTS as a movement, has its pros and its cons. We have this ability now to work around problems like never before, with this understanding of how this works. But we see coaches that like everything tries to become more optimal. I love Michael Goulden's water cooler test. If it takes me longer to set up an exercise than it takes my client to get water, it's too complex. And when we see people like again, there's a point of this. If you go to RTS and learn from Michael, we may measure sternum angle, but it does not mean you should get out a protractor with your clients, right? It doesn't mean we should spend 20 minutes setting up a band. You know, it doesn't mean we should have a luggage scale to assess a leg press. Like, just get them on it. Like, that's one that always gets me, is when people go, well, this leg press is only a third of the weight that's actually on the bar. Yeah, but if I've got 20 kilos on it and next week I've got 40 kilos on it, that's what matters.
Yeah.
Is it hard? Is it going in the right direction? Done.
Yeah, spot on. I couldn't agree more with that. I couldn't agree more. And sometimes you need to go too far to pull yourself back, right? I'm sure we both, when we
100%.
first started learning it, you go too far and you're like, oh, maybe that was too much, and then you pull yourself back. Yeah, so I get it, but then there's some people that just never ended up pulling themselves back.
Yeah, I had a bunch of clients that probably still eat meat and nuts at breakfast because it's the only way to do it, right? And I'm still a fan of the meat and nuts breakfast, right? But I've gone too far in every avenue you can ever imagine, and training is certainly a part of this. So, like, a couple of questions just to finish off, and I'm intrigued to see your take on this, as we kind of alluded to it a bit offline. What is your thoughts at the moment on the fitness industry as a whole? Do you think it's a beacon for good? Do you think there's nuance here? Like, what is your thoughts on our current standing?
Okay, cool. I'm going to steal something literally that Anthony told me last night, because I've not stopped thinking about it, is that people talk about the fitness industry like it goes in circles. Yeah, and it repeats the same cycles of mobility work, strength work, hard work, smart work, blah, blah, blah. And then it just, health results, and it just rotates. But in reality, I don't think it does that. And he said that he saw an image the other day, and he can't remember who posted it, but it is a spiral, but it's moving forward all the time. So we are circling. We always come back to the same things, but it kind of always moves forward with the time as well, based on whether it's the current research or, some great people in the industry like Tom Purvis that kind of changed the dogma around certain things. So I think that's in reality what the fitness industry does. I do go through my waves of getting frustrated with it, of course, because as we all think, there's a better way that things should be done or could be done our way. But for the most part, I think it's becoming divided. It's just, it's just forever becoming divided. You have different camps. People feel like they find their tribe that fits their cognitive bias, and that's who they cling on to, because whether it's that's who they agree with or whatever else, I think that's the issue. And again, something that I heard from actually Paul Standel that I've not stopped thinking, I think it was him that said it, that I've not stopped thinking about, is that you should try and agree with people that you dislike, and you should try and disagree with people that you like. And I love that as a sentiment, because too often we just like someone for who they are, and we just agree blindly with everything that they say. And I love nothing more than when my clients challenge me, or the people I'm educating challenge me and go, that doesn't make sense to me. What have you thought about it this way? Because that then forces me to grow as well. And that's what I try and do now more than anything, is just be critical of those I like and try and be accepting of those I dislike.
Yeah, I love that a lot, as regards to that, and because as well, like, just because someone's got something bang on in one area doesn't mean they can't be wrong in another. Like, we all make mistakes. We all don't understand things. We all have different ways of doing the same thing, right? Like, the length and range partial stuff, does it have some validity? Maybe, sure. Would I maybe start to buy a small length and range work in my programs? Maybe. Am I going to take a short and range exercise like a leg curl and put a wedge on it to make it more length and range? No, I'll just do an RDL because it's not meant to be. But it doesn't mean that I dislike people like Mike Isdell talks about that. But it doesn't mean Mike Isdell's wrong. He's one of the smartest guys in the space. I think the way I look at the industry these days is like, if you look at it like a pyramid, I think the pyramid is getting taller. I think the ability to get really good information has never been more accessible. We've mentioned people, like ICM and Callum Raystrick, Paul Standel, Tom Purvis, Michael Goulden, Luke Lehman. We've mentioned a bunch of people on this, and then we also do that, right? So the ability to get information is better than ever. But what scares me is the base of that pyramid is also getting broader, and we're getting more people that I think this industry has more of an ability to impact people's health than doctors. Now, I'm not saying that we're more important than doctors, but what I am saying is that doctors see their clients when the lump's already grown and the arm's already fallen off, and they are there just to put out fires. And people criticize them for not talking about lifestyle advice, but how many coaches struggle with adherence? And they speak to their clients multiple times a week, not once every 10 years. They just need to get rid of the headache. So I think we have that bigger ability, yet coaches are more uneducated as a whole than ever before. And that scares me. But I think I like that spiral analogy. I think the shift will happen. And I think for as much as we hate on it, and I said this before we came on air, I think Stephen Bartlett will be the cause of that shift. I think more clients are now going to have bad experience with coach. They're going to get the DM scripts. They're going to see through them. And they're also going to go, hey, I heard about this thing called autophagy or microbiome on a podcast. And coaches, whether it's important or not to consider these things, coaches are going to be either, oh, cool, let me tell you about that and why it's relevant or not relevant to you right now. Or they're going to go, calorie deficit. And those coaches are going to lose retention quickly. So on that note, because, I definitely consider you somebody that's is up towards the top of this pyramid. What are 3 things that's made you a better coach?
Okay. I'm going to challenge something you literally just said, but in Stephen Bartlett's book...
if you want to challenge me, go for it.
Yeah. Well, in his book, he said something that really clicked with me, more so because I can reflect and go, okay, well, yeah, that's basically the route I took. Have you read his book?
Whose book are we talking about here?
Stephen Bartlett's.
Oh, no, I haven't. No.
Okay. So there's one part in it where he talks about 5 buckets, right? And this is something that I actually use with my coaches all the time to kind of explain the trajectory of their life. And the 5 buckets are like it's knowledge, skills, people, resources, reputation, right? And I very much think that's the trajectory our industry, and that's the right trajectory of our industry. Knowledge and skills. Knowledge, what we learn, how we educate ourselves, the information that we're amassing. Skills is how we can apply it. Yeah. People, I genuinely do see that probably the most under-talked thing about the online coaching space, and everyone puts it on a pedestal as this amazing thing. Every online coach that I speak to in person says how lonely they are, right? Like, because they're just not surrounded by people anymore. Like, the reason most of us got into the fitness industry was because we actually enjoyed being around people, and then we somehow idolize this idea of escaping from every other person. And I think there's a balance. I think we need our space and we need to be around people. But I think they're the first three things. And they're
just on that, sorry to cut you off. Sorry to cut you off, but I think because I think that's a really important thing there. Like, because it's so easy to slip away from that without realizing it. Like, for me, I was surrounded by a lot of people for all the time I was in one-to-one coaching. And I like all these people. If anyone listens to this, this is not a knock on you, but I wanted to surround myself with people that push me forward. And to do that, I need to go and put myself in new exposures, not the same environment day to day. So I left the gym floor with the pursuit of having more time to go and meet these people. And in the first month, I went to a TMP event. I went up to Liverpool and spoke to Graphit. I went and did a 6 weeks with Michael Goulden. I went down to Winning Health and spent time with Tom Hibbert. And then as I built this office with my skeleton and my funky webcam, and like, I'm now like, well, I don't want to do a sales call. I'm not here. I don't want to have to do my call from a coffee shop because I can't use my whiteboard if someone asks me a question. And then slowly but surely, I'm like, oh, I've slipped into, I'm not lonely, but I've slipped into, oh, I need a change of scenery. By my own design. And I didn't realize it until recently when I went, oh, I've not seen anyone from the neck down in a while. So it's not even a conscious thing. You just slip into it. As your service gets better, your standard can't be below. It can't be from a black sheep coffee shop.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think there's ways around it. I think you can be a full-time online coach and still see people in person, we can host client events and actually, you can still cultivate a lot of connection online. Obviously, we met through Supercharged. I've got my online coaching group that I run live calls with. I've got the CCA groups that I run. I've got tons of live calls every week. But there is still that human element of like just being there in person with someone is so good. And I think, like a holiday, just make sure periodically you've got that booked in so that you don't lose that skill,
So much. Yeah. And it helps you as well, right? I've done a seminar where I've gone like, when I haven't done a seminar in 6 to 8 months in person, I start to lose that enthusiasm a little bit. And it's just because I don't have that vigor. When I go to a weekend seminar, I spend an hour with somebody in the industry, I come back and like, I can't wait to get to my clients. And even if I don't apply anything that I've learned from that person, the energy alone helps my clients.
Yes, so good. So good. And it's just something that we need to maintain in this industry while everything's shifting online. Look out for those in-person events where possible, because they're so worthwhile. And like you said, don't even look at the lineup and go, well, there's nothing I can learn from that. Just look at it and go, I can be around people. I can network with other coaches. There'll always be something I can learn. But yeah, to go back to those three points,
made that mistake
knowledge, skills, people.
Yeah. I made that mistake this week. I should have gone to PerformX. I labeled it as a marketing event and a bullshit marketing event. And I agree. PerformX, I'm calling you out. Bullshit marketing event, not a PT event. But then I thought, who are the people that are going?
Yeah.
I'm like, I should have just gone. Right? I got into it, it's not worth it. And that was such a stupid, arrogant statement from me. I should have been like, do you know what? Like, every event I've gone to, whether I've enjoyed the event or not, I've learned from the people around it. Now, and it doesn't matter whether they're more experienced than me or not. It could be a 1-year PT that teaches me a bit of wisdom or just a connection. I'm like, I wish I'd gone. I should have done it. And so I absolutely agree with that. So last question that I always ask everyone on the show, and it's to deliberately catch people off guard, and don't worry if you don't have an answer immediately, you have to think about it. But what is one thing you have changed your mind on? And whilst you're having to think, I always ask this question because I think it's so, in an Instagram world where we can look at your profile and go, oh, Jack's got this education business, he coaches coaches, and these clips from these events look amazing. And we forget that we're still making this up as we go along too. And we make mistakes. And this is why I ask this question to people, because it's like, we're all human.
Okay, so personally, I used to have a massive problem with being right. I think I still do to an extent. But
Me too.
I think I prided a lot of myself in the industry when I first came into the industry. I was actually relatively academic. Like, I actually enjoyed educating myself. So when you were around other coaches and they were all saying, oh, you know, I was rubbish in school and I'm really practical, I kind of felt a little bit like ostracized in a weird way, because I was like, oh, maybe I don't fit in here. Like, you know, I enjoy academia quite a lot. And I think a lot of my security in our industry came from being right then, because I knew quite a lot. And as I developed and developed, I became into more challenging environments where I was maybe right less of the time. And I really struggled with that. So being right, I'm okay being wrong now. I think a little bit more. My wife would laugh at that. She would disagree. But I think for the most part, like,
Mine too.
I'm better. Yeah, right. I'm better at being wrong. Professionally, it took me 7 years to invest in a business course. And I think that was a huge shift in mindset, where if you talked to me this time last year, I would have been like, there is no time where you need to invest in a business course at all. I don't think it's necessary. I think you just become better and better and better at what you do, and your business will thrive. Because that's what I'd witnessed over 7 years. Actually, having invested now in my business, I see the value in it. But I think the timing is important, you know, because I think in reality, you're going to really struggle to get to the last two buckets, the resources and mostly reputation. I think you're not really going to get there unless you invest in your business. The issue is most people try and fill that one first, and they're trying to build a reputation off the back of no results, no time in the industry. Like, you can't be a coach for 6 months and have a reputation like Mark Coles. Like, it just doesn't happen. You know, you need to do your time, you need to do your hours. So that would be something that I've changed my mind on professionally, is I actually do see the value in business courses. I just think the timing is very, very appropriate.
I think out of all the answers I've had to that question in the show, that's the one I've resonated with, especially the first one. I think I've had exactly the same backstory as you in that, like, coming from an academic background to a degree, and always wanting to learn more about it. Sometimes I still to this day, like, think it annoys me in the industry when I have no issue with clients not knowing stuff. I'm never going to be condescending to someone that works with me, but I can maybe without knowing it be very condescending to people that seem like they don't give a fuck about learning. And I'm just like, that's when I'm like, you don't want to learn how to get better? Leave. And I'm still trying to bring myself back around to being that, and like that superiority complex almost of like, well, I've learned this and I've invested and I've put in the graft, then you should do as well. So I can really relate to that. And I think the business course thing, I think you're right. I think, like, I've seen huge impacts on my business since having a business course. I also think the game has changed. I think at the time when you thought a business course wasn't worth it, it probably wasn't, because people were getting clients off merit. I don't think we're in that game anymore. I think you said, I think before we clicked on air, and maybe it was on the recording, that you've gone from being in shape yourself to how in shape your business is. I think that if you don't do that, you can be the best kept secret in the industry, which is such a shame if you're a high quality coach. But I think business course is an incredible investment, but you're right. I think it's easier to attain a client than get a new one. And most people are on this constant hamster wheel of needing leads because they have no ability to keep their clients happy and get results that people paid for. And I think, like, even though you've changed your mind on business, I don't think if you had your time again, you would have invested in a business course sooner. I think you would have just gone, you would have been, I'll open to this when I'm ready to do it, as opposed to, I'll change my mind, I will do that from year one.
Definitely.
So it took me 8 years. 8 years for me to do exactly the same thing.
Oh. Similar.
So to close off, where can people find you? How can people find out more about what you do?
So I guess Instagram is going to be the main place. At Jack Haigh Coaching is kind of where I'm posting a little bit more frequently nowadays. Obviously we have the M10 coaching page as well. That's where they can find out more about the education we provide at the CCA. But yeah, for me personally, Jack Haigh Coaching on Instagram. That I stick to just one platform. Two is too confusing for me.
I even struggle with emails, so I completely understand that. But mate, it's been an absolute pleasure chatting. Really, really good. Thank you for coming on the show.
Simon, thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Self-Made Podcast. If you're like me and like binge watching podcast episodes, click here to watch our latest episode. Or if you want to stay in touch and find out when the next episode goes live, click here to subscribe to the channel.